Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning. We're very, very pleased to have this event this morning on the complex domestic politics of U.S.-China relations. Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis is also very pleased to be co-hosting this event with Georgetown University. I'm Bates Gill. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for China Analysis here at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And it's just an enormous pleasure to have a fantastic panel of experts to talk on this interesting, very timely, and I think increasingly important question of how domestic politics in both the United States and China are increasingly having an impact, largely negative, on the bilateral relationship. The event today also serves, happily, as the launch of a new report by Evan Medeiros on this question. The report is entitled "The New Domestic Politics of U.S.-China Relations." You should have seen a card out there on one of the tables where you can access a QR code and download that report, which just came out this morning. What we're going to do is quickly introduce our speakers for everyone, and then talk a little bit about this new report, and then get some real insights from this fantastic panel, because all three of these folks have been, some continue to be, in many respects, highly influential within Washington, D.C. policy circles, especially around China policy, and get their insights about how the domestic dynamics in both China and in the United States continue to have such an important impact on how the two countries relate with one another. But let me start by just introducing our speakers for those of you who may not know them already. Evan Medeiros is a senior fellow for foreign policy at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. We're very happy to have Evan associated with us. He's also a professor and the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and you would know that Evan served for 6 years in the National Security Council under President Obama as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then elevated to the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia. And we're also very happy to have joining us today Liz Economy. She is a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and most recently, from 2021 to 2023, served as the Senior China Advisor for the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. You would all know Liz was formerly with the Council on Foreign Relations just down the street, and where she was the CV Star Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies there for more than 10 years. And last and certainly not least, we're very pleased that Liza Tobin is also able to join us. Liza is currently the Senior Director for Economy with the Special Competitive Studies Project in Washington, D.C. But prior to that, she served on the National Security Staff as China Director, where she led the development of multiple U.S. strategies and policies related to China. Prior to that, she served as for more than a decade in various capacities as a China specialist within the U.S. government. So we've got just a fantastic lineup of folks who can really give us some insights on this question of how domestic politics in China and in the United States have such a huge impact on constructive, stable, and hopefully at least productive relations between the United States and China. So let me begin by first asking Evan if you could just give us a quick snapshot on this new report that just came out this morning.
Great. Well, thank you, Bates. As a professor at a Jesuit university, I feel the need to begin my day as St. Ignatius did, which is with gratitude. Reflections on gratitude is how St. Ignatius talked about it. So, Bates, let me begin by thanking you.
Thank you.
The report is the result of a conversation we had, I don't know if you remember, about a year ago, talking about big important changes going on in the United States, and we agreed there were equally important changes going on in China and the need for somebody to dissect it. So I want to thank you and your staff that have been so helpful and so supportive in producing the report. I want to thank Liz and Liza for reading it. It's a big piece of work, some 30,000 words-ish, and look forward to your additions and subtractions. So in terms of the report, the title says it all, right? It looks at domestic politics in the United States and in China. And there are two unique things about the report. Number one is the fact that most of the research to date about domestic politics in the United States on China policy is largely focused on congressional dynamics. And that's incredibly important. And the study documents new and significant trends in congressional behavior. But there's a lot more going on in the United States. So the study looks at electoral politics, China in American elections. It looks at interest group politics, the business lobby, the Taiwan lobby, et cetera. It looks at bureaucratic politics, sort of the rack and stack, the blocking and tackling of how China policy gets made, and public opinion. So that was one piece of it, really trying to draw out all the dimensions of how America implicitly and explicitly debates China at all different levels of government and society. And then it pairs that discussion with a look at China, because one of my frustrations is that so much of the prevailing conversation and research about the relationship between politics and China policy is, oh, things are just so screwed up in the United States, we're never going to get it right. Well, the U.S. has its strengths and weaknesses, but so does China. And I think one of the innovations, the analytic innovations in the report, is pairing the analysis of the United States with the analysis of domestic politics in China. Now, of course, we simply don't have the level of granular understanding of bureaucratic politics in China that we do of the United States, because it's just not as open or transparent a system. So what I did was I sort of built a model for understanding domestic politics in China that looks at sort of what I call the personalization of foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And I look at the role of people in institutions and processes with a very heavy focus on the politicization and the centralization of decision-making. And then I look at sort of broad incentives in China, and in particular, the greater emphasis on national security, the greater emphasis on self-reliance, and how those policies in China will affect and ultimately distort the U.S.-China relationship. And, you know, I don't want to steal the thunder from the report, but the bottom line is we're now moving into an era where domestic politics will be just as important, if not more important, than geopolitics in influencing America's China policy, China's America policy, and the resulting dynamics. And the forces in both countries domestically are growing and creating headwinds to a relationship defined by stability, if not cooperation. So let me end there and turn it back to you, Bates.
Fantastic, concise, succinct, right to the point. Thanks, Evan. And let me just highly recommend this study to you. There's nothing else like it out there right now that digs as deeply into what may seem like an obvious point, that domestic politics are increasingly having such a huge impact. But this is a robust, in-depth, great evidence presented for us to really grasp just how important the domestic dynamics are. And importantly, not just putting the focus on the United States, but also pointing out that similar domestic dynamics and pressures are at play inside China as well, and are equally important, if not more so, in helping explain the difficulties and continued problems we're likely to see in U.S.-China relations going forward. So please do have a look at that. I wanted to get both Liz and Liza to just give your quick thoughts, your take. You've had a chance to have a look at the report. Tell us what you think. Liz, you first.
Sure. So, in the field of China studies, there are the good and there are the great. And Evan is a great. So I knew when Bates asked me to review the report and that Evan had written it, I was like, okay, I know it's going to be great. And I can just get up here and say, oh, this report's really great, and you should all read it. Okay, so that would make my life really easy, make your life really easy. Then I thought, oh, that really wouldn't be doing a service to Evan, right? So my remarks, probably about twice as long as Evan's there. I'll try to make them a little more concise. Let me talk a little bit about what I think the report does really well, and then where I think maybe there's room to take this to like stage 2, right? And maybe do a follow-on report that digs down into a couple of aspects. Okay. So for this, I need my glasses. So I do think what the report does incredibly well is to provide a terrific typology of the relevant actors in the U.S.-China relationship, and that in and of itself is a really important addition to our understanding of the sort of why U.S.-China relations is moving in the direction that it is, as he said, becoming more complex and more oppositional in many respects. In particular with decline of the role of the U.S. business community, which Evan details, I think, in really important ways. Because that was a community that supported a really proactive and robust U.S.-China relationship. And then, as Evan mentioned, he really digs down deep into the role of Xi Jinping and the way in which he also, acts to constrain debate and dissenting views. I also think he does a terrific job of providing the evidence to support how things have changed over time. So this is not just a snapshot of the U.S.-China relationship today. He takes us, all the way back through history and looks at, for example, what's going on in Congress and how the number of bills, resolutions has just skyrocketed in recent years, and the much more assertive role in many respects that Congress is playing today. But also, of course, the important role that Congress played, back at the time of normalization, back in the late 70s with the Taiwan Relations Act and other things. So again, you get a sense of history of the trajectory. So again, a really important report, and I think if you were going to take it to sort of stage 2, here are a couple of thoughts that I had. I think first, and you mentioned the challenge of getting greater granularity in the Chinese Chinese domestic decision-making process. I think you do a great job when it comes to the People's Liberation Army, the security apparatus. But I think there are other actors that you could actually look at, for example, think tanks, and sort of explore some of the debates within think tanks and think through how those might be playing into the decision-making process. Does the departure of wealthy entrepreneurs and their capital to Singapore make any difference, right, in how policies is being shaped? Other groups within China, I think the report is great in the bureaucratic level, but I think at the sort of societal level, there's more that could be explored. It wouldn't be easy. You'd have to do interviews. This is a different kind of report. Sure. But I think that would be another thing to look at. Returnees, students who've gone back, what role are they playing in the bureaucracy, for example? Are they helping to promote a more positive relationship, less positive relationship? I think to get at this, maybe it would be great to do an in-depth case study, right? So throughout the report, you look at different points in time and illuminate different aspects of the relationship. Again, really interesting and really important. But if you could pick one issue and track it, even if you did it for one period of time, just the Biden administration or the Trump administration, and just looked across and saw how were domestic politics interacting to arrive at X decision or Y decision, both in China and the United States. Might be almost impossible to do in China, but nonetheless to try, I think would be super interesting and would help, I think, bring together all the different elements that you sort of explore in the report. And then, okay. All right, here I got to take some issue with you. Coming from commerce. Okay, this is a little personal, I have to say. So one of the things that you talk about, and you probably know where I'm going. No, not the ERC. That part where you say that probably we're a little weak in commerce and treasury because we don't have that many people with China expertise. I would say it's not the number of people, it's the quality of the people. Right. And while state has a crap load of people. And the NSC has a bunch of people. Actually, when you look at policy in this particular period, I would say it's been a lot driven by Treasury and Commerce, by those few outstanding people. So let me just maybe not finish with that point, but I think I have one more point to make if I can move my pages here. I think. Yeah, so the other thing that made me think, this report made me think of, and this is not something that I would expect in this report at all, but it just made me think of it, is does this pattern that you describe play out in other advanced democracies? I mean, it just made me think about what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Japan, South Korea, and the shifts that we're seeing in all those countries when it comes to China policy as well. And so that just, your report really brought to mind, in all of these countries, are we seeing similar domestic politics play out with the business community, with the parliaments, or, and elements. So, in any case, great report, Evan. Thank you. And,
Thanks,
just change
Liz.
that one part I mentioned.
We'll go back and
edit that.
Yeah, you lead that one part. Thanks a lot, Liz. Liza, your thoughts on the report?
Thank you so much, Bates, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Asia Society, and I feel, quite lucky to be on the stage with two real giants in the China field. So thank you so much.
You got to say three, because Bates is here too.
Actually, I can't. He's the moderator.
Sorry,
Let's agree to that.
Thanks, Liz.
Absolutely.
No problem, Bates.
So definitely read the report. It's a great read. Well, first of all, I have to say I actually agree with Evan on the Commerce Treasury thing here. And I would say that there are a few rare stars at Commerce where the exception proves the rule. But I definitely agree with Evan that we need more China expertise at Commerce and Treasury. One is not enough, Liz. So first of all, I would commend Evan for identifying and filling this gap in the literature. He points out near the top of the report that there hasn't been much written really in the last quite a number of years on this topic. So it is very good that he's identified it and filled it. And someone with his level of practical on-the-ground experience dealing with these issues in policy as well as academia, there's no one better to fill this gap. So I think he's done an excellent job detailing just how much more complex the bilateral relationship is, given this proliferation of variables that he points out: media, Congress, different business interests, so on and so forth, the specialized focus across different departments and agencies of the U.S. government. So I think putting the whole story together really makes a point about how much things have changed since China was this niche foreign policy issue 10 or 20 years ago. Arguably, you can say it was a lot simpler, if not easier, but at least simpler to manage back then when there were fewer eyes on the problem. Particularly interesting to me, Liz already mentioned this, but how he traced the changes in the business lobby and his reminder that 10 or 20 years ago, there was a lot more perhaps unity in the business lobby, pushing coherently for more opening with China, more trade and economic ties with China, and pointing out that now it's quite fractured, and so you have much smaller coalitions of business actors pushing for different things that kind of perhaps even cancel each other out and kind of nullify some of that what used to be more of a unified voice. I think where I would push Evan a bit more, it's really kind of just one big issue. What comes through to me quite clearly is this very strong and heavy emphasis on Xi Jinping personally in driving these changes he describes. And perhaps that's done at the expense of structural or ideological factors that, to me, have perhaps an equal amount, if not more, of an explanatory power for where we've ended up in bilateral ties. So I would really love to know, I think, as part of the discussion, is this an artifact of how you designed the study, the fact that you framed it as domestic politics on both sides? Is that why it's ended up with such a heavy emphasis on Xi Jinping? Or is it truly your analytic views? Another way of putting it is domestic politics in China and or Xi Jinping himself the critical driving factor in the deterioration of ties? Or is it structural and or ideological factors? Of course, it's all three. It's always a mix, but where do you put the emphasis? The paper, it comes through as putting a lot of emphasis on Xi. And of course, this is a raging debate in the China field. How much of a onus do you put on Xi Jinping personally for how U.S.-China ties and really China's role in the world and their assertiveness and aggressiveness, how much of that is owing to Xi personally versus other factors? What do I mean by structural factors? Of course, China's growing comprehensive national power just by any kind of objective measure, military, economic, technological. It's a very different China than we had 10, 15 years ago. That's stating the obvious. Ideological, I'm referring, of course, to the Marxist-Leninist framework and the political philosophy that the CCP uses to interpret this growing comprehensive national power, how they assess China is doing at moving forward towards their goal, assessing how much comprehensive national power they have, and then making adjustments to the strategy. You can think of this as a system working, or you can put the onus on Xi and say Xi was this central factor in driving them to accelerate their pursuit of their ambitions and become more aggressive. Or maybe it was the party itself. Of course, it's really hard to know for certain because it's a hypothetical. But I guess I would ask, if we could remove Xi Jinping from the equation, these structural factors would still be in place. Presumably, the ideological factors would still be in place. So would we have ended up in more or less the same position we are now? Evan paints a very grim picture towards the end of the report about the outlook. He expects tensions to continue. I completely 100% agree with him there. But the drivers for this change are really important. If we attribute this mainly to Xi Jinping himself, then I think policymakers in the U.S. are perhaps kind of holding their breath, waiting for Xi to be gone. I mean, that could be a very long time, of course. He's only 70. But you're kind of waiting and thinking, well, if he did leave, then maybe we'll have hope of sort of getting back on the right track and reducing tensions. But if the decline is mainly attributable to structural and ideological factors, then we're not waiting around for Xi Jinping. We're just, we are where we are. We're in a position of long-term rivalry, and we have to kind of deal with that without sort of any hope of near-term or medium-term change. So I would just love to hear Evan's views on that and where he kind of comes down on how those factors have driven this decline. So the question really, I guess, to sum it up is Xi Jinping the prime obstacle to more constructive relations between China and the U.S.?
The $60 million question. Thank you, Liza, for that. And Evan, if we get a chance, you want to respond to some of these critiques and feedback, it'd be great. What I'd like to do is just turn for a second away from the report itself and just to the broader question of the impact and importance of the domestic dynamics in China and the United States and how it's affecting relations, because all three of you have had direct personal experience in grappling with these dynamics as a part of your work to at least stabilize or improve or create some sort of constructive way forward in the bilateral relationship. And last night at dinner, I got a sense that you all had your own war stories to tell about this in your work. And so I just thought it'd be interesting for all of us to just hear a couple of real life stories and your own experience of how the domestic dynamics have shaped how you have tried to affect policy in the U.S.-China relationship. And Liza, you said you had a long list of great stories to tell. Maybe I
don't know if they're great.
Maybe just pick
talk a lot.
Maybe just pick one and and particularly. I mean, let's start with China. I mean, could you give us some good example, or just one great example, good example of how you confronted this domestic dynamic in China toward the U.S.-China relationship that really, in important ways, affected or shaped, how you could get things done with them?
So I was in the White House from the middle of 2019, so during the Trump administration, when the first tranche of tariffs had been imposed, and we're kind of working towards the next tranche, all the way to November 2021, so the first year of the Biden administration. I'd say one really visceral example of this, Bates, was the CCP leadership's opacity in the early days of COVID. Of course, China already had a track record of withholding flu samples and things like that, there was an agreement under the WHO for sharing these samples so that scientists could learn from each other, and they had been withholding that for several years going into COVID. And then, you remember in early 2020, the phase one trade deal was signed in January 2020. And then things started to decline very rapidly as COVID spread out of China into the rest of the world. And really, I remember very early in January, throughout January, starting to have these interagency policy meetings saying what's going on in China, what do we need to do here? There were very early discussions of, are we going to need to close schools, close workplaces? Are we going to need to shut down travel? There was a lot of churn and discussion around that. But Beijing's lack of transparency in those early weeks really undermined the kind of potential for any kind of positive collaboration between the U.S. and China on COVID in what was really, to devastating effect on the world writ large and the global economy. I think so that really set the stage, and I'd say U.S.-China relations took a very distinct turn for the worse in those first 3 months of 2020, particularly March 2020. By that point, of course, the world was shut down in mid-March. The president saw the writing on the wall. The global economy was tanked. The U.S. economy was tanked. And he had come out of this phase one trade deal, which was an accomplishment, an economic accomplishment. And by March 2020, it was clear that we were headed for one of the worst recessions for many years. And I think the president knew at that point that his re-election prospects were much worse. And so he became very angry at China, blamed it on COVID, blamed it on the pandemic. And so just the turn from some glimmers of hope with the phase one trade deal to sort of the phase one trade deal basically became an asterisk in terms of its economic importance at that point. So I think it was really quite dramatic and seeing kind of the blame games that came out of that. That's
a great example. And I take your point that really was a significant downturn, March 2020, in the relationship. Arising out of this sort of Chinese domestic sort of predilection towards opacity and so on. Liz, how about you? You were right at the center of things the last couple of years, trying to see some improvement in the relationship. What sort of obstacles did you confront regarding the Chinese domestic situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the biggest one, obviously COVID, because China was closed. So actually doing anything with China, going there, it was impossible, basically, until the spring. And so in the spring, I went with a colleague to meet with economic colleagues in China, assess the viability of Secretary Raimondo making a trip to China to try to get the business relationship, economic relationship back on track. And I think what we discovered was just overall an enormous enthusiasm, right, from the econ side in China, and just a desire to get the relationship back on track. We met with also a lot of U.S. companies, the representatives in China who had been suffering not only because they lived through COVID in China, which was incredibly difficult, but also because the political tensions in the bilateral relationship meant that their CEOs weren't coming to visit. There was, as Evan details in the report, much less enthusiasm for China as kind of the #1 market and a place where businesses were going to continue to invest. And these were people who had just come off of this 3-year terrible experience and were finding, and of course their businesses had all sorts of problems because of the supply chain issues and even supply chain issues within China. So they've really been through the ringer, and they come out of this to discover that they are no longer the darlings, right, of the many American companies, right? The China. China is just not the market that and the sort of site for investment that a lot of U.S. companies now consider to be #1. And so just what they were looking for from us was a kind of an effort just to begin talking, just to begin to get the relationship a little bit on more of an even keel. And so when we came back, I think we were, despite the fact that, the securitization of the relationship, right? Everybody talks about Xi Jinping securitizing the relationship, meaning that security now is number one over the economy, and of course, pushing issues of national security in through the economy, right? So making it much more challenging in that regard as well. So despite that, I think we believed that we had the potential to help the relationship move forward, in a limited way. And I will say that when Secretary took her trip, it was as good as we could have hoped for in terms of we got all the meetings we asked for. The Chinese were extremely forthcoming with all of them, from the premier on down, with the issues that they wanted to talk about. The talks were incredibly pragmatic, no discussion of Taiwan, no mention of Xi Jinping thought. They really were, and then candid, right? So, initial remarks and then just back and forth between the secretary and her counterparts. And so now, having said that, of course, the minute that we got back, right, there's a huge meme with the secretary as though she's advertising Huawei Mate phone, right? Different part of the bureaucracy, security part of the bureaucracy came out and said that the trip and all of the effort around U.S.-China relationship was just, old wine in a new bottle. And so you began to see that fracturing, right, in the system, right? So from the econ side of things, which really did want to have a more constructive relationship, of course, in part because the Chinese economy is, having its challenges, and they're deeply concerned about U.S. investment and, supply chain diversification, and, so there's something driving them there. But nonetheless, you could see the other side, right, of the bureaucracy sort of pushing back, right? Like, let's not have this relationship start moving forward, too far, too fast. And the Chinese side reached out to say, we hope this isn't going to spoil the relationship. So I think that was quite telling.
That's interesting, and I've heard you say this many times before. Even one-party authoritarian states have politics. Yes, they do, and you saw it very much in this fracturing and division and pushback that you experienced. Evan, do you want to add to this point at all? Like, when you were in the White House, did you also sort of sense that the domestic politics in China were creating all sorts of difficulties?
Yeah, over 6 years, loads and loads of examples. I would say on the U.S. side, Congress had not really gotten into the China policymaking game as actively as it has in the last few years. I was at the NSC from 2009 to 2015, and there wasn't an enormous amount of legislative activity, certainly nothing approaching the last 3 years. Congress, I would say, was not a major force, positively or negatively, in shaping our China policy. In terms of interest groups, the business community at that time was still quite positive about the U.S.-China relationship. Trade with China grew 5 times the growth in U.S. global trade during the 2010s, and so there was still a sort of residual momentum from that in the early Obama administration, even during the global financial crisis, right? A lot of American companies were benefiting from that massive Chinese stimulus during the global financial crisis. So you had the business community that remained very positive, very active. But interestingly, we started to have problems with China on tech, in particular cyber-enabled economic espionage. Right, you had the very famous hack of Google in January of 2010. So you begin to see the tech part of the equation, right? Facebook and Google, think they're going to get into China, but they're having a really hard time, right? So you begin to those were the sort of early stages of the sort of the fracturing of the business community, or the diversification of the business community sentiment towards China. Taiwan was quite interesting, and it's glad to see Ambassador Ray Burkhart's here. He was the chairman of American Institute in Taiwan, so he was sort of the administration's point guy on Taiwan. And Ray, you'll remember, we had this funny period where Ma Ying-jeou came in. He was the president of the KMT after 8 years of the sort of nominally pro-independence DPP party. And when he came in, we basically talked with him and said, like, look, you should deal with us. In other words, deal with the executive branch. We will we will work with you. Please don't try and circumvent us. gin up all this pressure in Congress to put on the administration, negotiate with us. And it was sort of the first time this had happened because the Chen Shui-bian era had been so complicated. So what happened was, for much of the Obama administration, the Taiwan lobby was actually very quiescent. It was not a force constraining or enabling administration policy. So the domestic politics in the United States in the Obama administration were just a very, very different complexion across interest groups. In terms of China, sure, there was, basically the dysfunctions of the Chinese system. So some of you may remember a very specific narrow incident in January of 2011 when then Secretary of Defense Bob Gates goes to China. And while he was there, the Chinese publicly tested, or the PLA publicly tested for the first time, I think it's the J-11. It was their 5th generation fighter. And it was this huge thing because it basically looked like the Chinese were trying to embarrass or put pressure on the Secretary of Defense. And really what it was the right hand and the left hand in the PRC system not knowing what was going on, right? Fast forward, that was 2011, fast forward to fall of 2013, a few days before then Vice President Biden was going to China, Japan, and Korea for a long-planned trip, the Chinese announced that they're deploying an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea, which was their effort to sort of put pressure on the Japanese over the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. And it has huge implications for the U.S. because if you deploy that ADIZ, how American commercial carriers flying through that area, how they will operate becomes an open question. Because as a matter of policy in Washington, if Washington says we don't recognize this, what the FAA actually tells United Airlines to do and what United tells their pilots to do can be a totally different thing. And subsequently what we found out is the PLA wanted to do this. Xi Jinping said, yeah, do it. And the foreign ministry was totally out of the loop, right? Not understanding that there were massive international implications, not just for the U.S.-China relationship, but China's relations with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, et cetera. Anybody flying through that ADIZ.
These are great examples of how the diverse sets of interest groups in China have various approaches how they want to handle the U.S.-China relationship,
exactly.
And can significantly undermine what otherwise have been some efforts towards progress. And I guess just to maybe wrap up from your own experiences, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. You mentioned a little bit about how the U.S. dynamic wasn't that much of a factor, you didn't think, while you were in office, or you didn't feel it was as strong a factor as it is today. It'd be great just to have a few quick examples from you about where do you see now? What do you think are some of the important U.S. domestic factors that have this increasingly sort of negative or powerful effect upon how the administration can operate with China? Just hear a little bit from all three of you. You go ahead, Evan, start with
yeah, so in the report, one of the things I do is I develop this sort of taxonomy. It's well known in the China Watcher world, but I look at congressional politics, I look at interest group politics, I look at bureaucratic politics, electoral politics, and public opinion. And all of them are putting downward pressure. Congress has sort of newly discovered China in the sense that they're now incredibly active in both their legislative authorities as well as their oversight authorities, right? And that's how a democracy should work. That's not meant to be critical, but what it's doing is Congress is now, simply a much more significant actor. And I detail just in the last 3 years the number of laws that have been passed by Congress, right? Some of which are, very, very significant for our relationship with how we interact with Hong Kong, with Taiwan. The business community cares an enormous amount about the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which I'm sure Liv's dealt with at the Commerce Department, that places huge regulatory burdens on any company importing an item from China that may have as part of its supply chain items from Xinjiang. Congress is sort of getting very creative in not just passing laws, but basically passing laws within the annual National Defense Authorization Act. So, yeah, Congress is newly in the game, big important actor, and then you have things like the trip of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, right? That was a decision by her to do that. And, you have the Select Committee on the CCP. I mean, all sorts of areas where, Congress is not just sort of shaping the environment, putting boundaries around the executive branch, but directing action, right? So Congress is a big actor. I look at electoral politics, and the 2020 presidential election was a high watermark for China in both the presidential election, but as well as down ballot elections for House and Senate, right? And and I argue in the report that we should expect that level of attention on China, if not higher, in the next presidential election, right? I mean, we're in the middle of the Republican, I shouldn't say middle, we're in the early stages of the Republican primary right now, and China is a very high-profile issue, right? One of the most high-profile Republican candidates, Nikki Haley, her first big policy speech after, announcing her bid was all about China. She gave a big speech at AEI, right? Same thing at down-ballot elections. So China is very much in the going to be part of our electoral politics. Interest group politics, it's sort of a mix. But the fact that the business community is, I would say, at best mixed about the China opportunity, and I think increasingly reluctant in a politically charged environment to be active or to be seen as very active, right? I talk about how the grand coalitions to support renewal of most favored nation status, to support PNTR, all of those are gone, right? I mean, it used to be grand coalitions of businesses who worked with moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans who were pro-trade, right? So that whole, dimension of the U.S.-China relationship, is gone. And then, bureaucratically, one of the most notable things that I detail in the report is the rise of the national security establishment in the United States. And, in large part because the national security threats to the United States have gone up. And we see that across the board, whether it's in how we look at export controls, the number of investigations that the Department of Justice is doing, the expansion of all sorts of lists of Chinese entities that American businesses can and cannot do business with, who you can invest in, who you can't invest in, I mean, all sorts of things. The one thing the report does not do, which in retrospect I should have included, was look at the changing complexion of subnational dynamics. So what's going on at the state level. 10 years ago, governors and mayors were strong proponents of bilateral trade and investment. China was buying a lot of their goods, and Chinese investment were creating jobs. And I think that dynamic has really changed. I think there's a lot more concern, especially in states with Republican legislators and governors, to try and pull back from investment from China, right? There are, state teachers' pension funds which can't invest in, Chinese stocks, for example. Debates in Florida about whether or not PRC citizens can buy certain types of property or where they can buy property. So that dynamic has really changed. I didn't get into it in the report, and maybe in version 2.0, Bates.
I was going to mention that, Evan, a 2.0, and I think that would be a fantastic study. You would recall from, say, 10 or 20 years ago that the strongest proponents for a robust economic and trade relationship with China would point to the states, and would even right down to the legislative district level, the federal legislative district level, and you saw these sort of heat maps at the district level of the degree of Chinese investment or the degree of jobs created by Chinese investment or Chinese firms, and that was intended as a way of advocating for the relationship with China. I don't see much of that happening anymore. Right. I'm sure people are still generating those sorts of analyses, but as you say, even down to the state level, it's become almost, in some cases, taboo to be a proponent in some respects. I recall seeing recently that something like 30 or 35 U.S. states today have one level or another of restriction upon Chinese investment in the states. I mean, you'd probably be very familiar with that. Is that about right, Liz?
I don't know the exact count. I will note, it's interesting, in some of my earlier research, when I was looking at Chinese investment abroad overseas, so this is back in the mid-2010s, many countries, including countries in Latin America and elsewhere, once Chinese investment started coming in land in particular, in heavy, like they started going overseas, partly sometimes for agriculture, sometimes because there were other resources that they wanted, mineral resources or other things. You started to see country after country pass laws to prevent Chinese investment. And they didn't call it like Chinese investment, but all of a sudden you would see these laws. So in some ways, the United States is just almost late to the game. It's not like we're actually leading the charge, but actually following from a number of emerging economies in any case. I don't know about the advanced economies. But yes, I think it's actually, I think, a problem, and we don't really want to have different states with different kinds of rules, and I think it's something that the U.S. government really should look at and figure out strategy in a sort of more focused and principled way.
Sounds like a job for the Commerce Department, Liz.
Yeah, okay, we're on it, Evan. All right.
And all the China experts.
We are the #1 agency,
Right,
that's
right.
right. So thank you for recognizing that.
Thanks a lot for that. And we have about maybe 10 or so minutes remaining to us, 10, 15 minutes. I want to see if we wanted to have any questions or comments raised from the audience. I see Dan Rosen's hand going up. Let's hear from Dan, and then we'll get to some of the other speakers. Do we have a microphone for Dan, please? Thank you.
This is awesome work that you've done, Evan, and the comments from the panelists. Terrific stuff. Question, can you speak a little bit to what's the state of understanding in the relationship that we do not interfere in one another's domestic politics? I sometimes often lately hear the U.S. side trying to offer reassurance to Beijing that no, regime change is not one of our objectives, and it's said in such a way that it suggests to me that there's a real concern that is something that people worry about. It's a variable in the dynamics here, and so the sort of messing with one another's domestic politics as a consideration. Anything to offer on that?
I can say one thing, and then everybody else should contribute. I mean, I think there's enormous concern in the United States about Chinese influence operations here, whether it's from establishing covert police stations to putting pressure on Chinese students here to all different kinds of influence operations, media, everything. So I think there's no respect in which that's not a concern right now in the United States. In terms of the opposite, I mean, look. For 40 years, there was a strain of U.S. policy that was about peaceful evolution, right? That was actually a tag phrase, I think during the Bush 1 administration maybe. But engagement had, within it, not only having China become a responsible stakeholder in the international system, adhering to international norms and rules, but also that as China developed economically, as it began to sign up to all of those different rules and regulations, parts of the liberal international order, that it too would become more like a market democracy. And I've tracked this in the statements of national security advisors and secretaries of states throughout time. So I think there's reason for the Chinese to be concerned about it because it was a strain of U.S. foreign policy. I think the point now is this administration, for sure, and I think the Trump administration as well in a different way, is saying we recognize, right, not that maybe we wouldn't wish for something different for you, China, but that we recognize that that's not where you're at, and we are not attempting through our policies to make that happen. What we are doing is ensuring that our domestic actors who are engaged in China aren't doing things that undermine our values, hence things like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
I mean, I think senior officials in the Trump administration were pretty forthright in trying to draw the distinction between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. But Liza, you wanted to
yeah, I
add
think
here.
Dan raises a really important point about interfering in each other's political affairs. And of course, the CCP has an intense amount of neuralgia about it sees that behind every policy move that the U.S. makes. But so one thing Evan did really well in the report was pointing out the change in how the business lobby has affected U.S. policy towards China. And he says, Beijing has lost its strongest and most convincing support group in the United States, altering the political economy of U.S.-China relations for the long term. And that's absolutely right. But I think your point raises sort of an interesting thing that's happening where some of this interference that Beijing is trying to do in our system has actually gone underground, because it's now taboo, I think, in much of the business community to be seen as openly advocating for stronger U.S.-China business ties. Beijing has adapted its strategy to use more subtle and hidden ways. And I think, so you've seen perhaps a rise in China hiring U.S.-based lobbying firms to kind of act on its interests sort of behind the cloak of an American law firm, an American lobbying firm. China quietly bringing court cases in U.S. court systems against U.S., basically manipulating and using our system against us. So I think while at this high level, Evan rightly points out that this business lobby in the U.S. has lost its coherence and lost perhaps its strong degree of influence over the direction of U.S.-China policy, China has now adapted and it's gone underground, and that would be something that would be worth study, I think.
Thank you, Liza. Others, Margot, please.
Thank you. Really great discussion this morning. Evan, you raised the issue of Congress getting more and more active. And I'd love to hear from all of you what we, the public, the voter perhaps, might be able to do to help Congress make more informed legislation, policy, thinking of Nancy Pelosi's trip. I imagine that it was well-intentioned, but did her staff really think about the damage that her trip could do to Taiwan, which she was trying to support? That's obviously not legislative, but on the legislative side, it seems to me sometimes that Congress's actions are counterproductive. And I wonder if you 3 or 4, Bates, see a role that the public can play in improving this situation.
Anyone care to weigh in on improving Congress's approach? Evan, you want to take a crack at that?
Let's see. So, Margot, in the report, one thing we haven't talked about is public opinion. And what's painfully clear from the data about American public opinion toward China is it has become very negative very, very quickly. So I think that we live in a democracy. The public should always be engaged, and if they have views, should share them with their members of Congress, and I think that's important. I think as Congress has gotten more involved in China policy, I think we need to be careful not to say, or we need to be careful that assuming just because Congress is doing something we don't like, that they're poorly informed, because China policy is rapidly moving to in an era where legitimate smart people have different views about how to address the complexity of challenges before facing American policymakers. So, I always support the American public, everybody in the room, getting involved, getting yourselves up to speed, educated on issues, sharing them with your members of Congress and the Senate. That's how America works best. Most basically, everybody should vote, right? and so of course I strongly support that. But it's important to understand where public opinion is on China. And, there are a lot of people with a lot of very legitimate concerns about Chinese behavior, economic behavior. Like Liz, I'm very concerned about these sort of Chinese influence operations in the United States, the, covert police station in the lower part of Manhattan, buying up of American media, right? These kinds of things. We need to be very, very mindful of that. And so what I'd like to see is just a more robust public debate about these issues, understanding that policymakers, are going to come out in different places. But the most important thing is we have robust, well-informed, fact-based debates.
Thanks, Evan. One more question. Lulu, you want to chime in here? Thanks very much.
Thank you all for really asking this. And most of the discussion has focused on the connects and not closing down between U.S. and China.
Conrad, could you give Lulu the mic, because folks in the back can't hear her.
So moving from the focus in this discussion about all the doors between U.S. and China that are beginning to close, if not already closed, are there any remaining common interests that we can explore? I know those who are casting about 4 ways to connect with China and U.S. have been focusing on the environment, focusing on healthcare, areas of great concern to both countries. Can you comment on that, if there's anything going on that we could be helpful there?
I think it's a great way to wrap this up, Lulu. It's kind of a look ahead. And, in addition to simply identifying these key issues where we could find common ground, let's link it back to the deep question we're trying to explore here. Not just a common issue, but how will it resonate within the domestic politics of both countries, right? Where can we move? Because obviously you've identified that that's a major obstacle now. So how do we link these issues of common ground through the dynamics of the domestic political systems? Liz, start with you, Evan and Liza.
Yeah, those issues are important, and they've been important, right? They're kind of the areas that we always go back to when we talk about potential cooperation, working together, and we saw some of that come out of the Xi-Biden summit. I will say, as someone who's, followed U.S.-China relations for, a quarter century at this point, that it's shocking to me. I feel almost as though we're back at square one in terms of like reweaving the fabric of this relationship. It's kind of astonishing. To me, one of the most important things is getting American students back in China, American undergraduates and American graduate students as well. I think to do that, we're going to need to provide a more secure environment, and also, people like all of us going back to China in a more directed and consistent manner, and having Chinese scholars come here. So it's not at this point simply a function of COVID, but it is of the environment in both countries, and arriving at an airport not knowing whether you're going to get through, even if you have a visa, for example, right? Getting detained. Scholars on both sides, getting detained. Even when people are parts of delegation, sometimes they get pulled out of a delegation and detained, right? So I think we need to get back to a place where that kind of exchange is welcomed and where the people traveling feel safe. And so for me, that should be one of the big priorities, I think, for the State Department, where they have 500 people working on China, is to get that back on track. Because I think without that, then you are dealing not only with a public that's concerned and potentially informed, but increasingly with a public that's not informed. And so I think that, to me, is number one priority.
Excellent, thanks. I'll go to Liza.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'd just add one thing to Liz's really excellent comments. I think the issues that are often talked about in terms of where it makes sense for the two superpowers to be cooperating are the right ones, climate, health, counter-narcotics. Those are the ones where it makes the most sense, I think, from a rational perspective, for the U.S. and China to be cooperating and making some headway. The problem is how. Of course, Beijing's intransigence, shutting the doors to cooperation and dialogue whenever they're provoked by something like Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. So I think the only thing I would add to this is that perhaps the best way the U.S. should approach this is to work multilaterally and to work first with its allies and partners and kind of show Beijing that it's moving forward, working with its allies and partners, Europe, others, on things like climate change, and giving Beijing a sense of FOMO that, well, the world is moving on without you to address these key issues, and you're welcome to come along and join. I think the UK recently held an AI safety summit. They first talked to allies and partners and invited them in. They also invited China, and China showed up. So this wasn't kind of segregated into a bilateral US-China issue. And I think that's really the right way for it to happen, for democracies to come together first and set the terms of how the global cooperation should happen, and then leave the door open for China to participate constructively if it's willing to do so.
Thanks, Liza. And Evan, last word to you in response to Lulu's question.
So, Lulu, I very much agree with the sentiment captured in your comment. But as an analyst and former policymaker, the reality is that all of those, we've tried in all of those issues, and the behavior of the past few years on the part of China has demonstrated, whether it's global health or the global economy or climate change, they're just not prepared to step up. And so I think that at least for the next 10 years or so, as we deal with leadership in China that is so negative about the United States, so distrustful, we see a rise of the national security bureaucracy, an emphasis on Chinese decoupling from the United States. As all these pressures and incentives grow, I think where the policy priority needs to be is focused on sort of developing those channels in the relationship, whether it's, crisis management, high-level dialogues, to manage through what I think is going to be a very, very challenging period in the U.S.-China relationship. And I hate to close on such a somber note, but the reality is we're just entering into a very challenging period, in part driven by the new domestic politics that I detail in the report.
Well, on that somber note, Evan, we have to close. I think we can still be hopeful, though, in thinking through, to the degree we can achieve levels of collaboration and cooperation. It's very clear that it's not going to happen simply because the two presidents say it will. Right. It's going to happen because, certainly from the U.S. point of view, because there's public support for it. And maybe that's an area where those who want to try and instill some greater stability and constructive future for this relationship need to start, is at that domestic level and engender a greater degree of public support for it, which I think is possible on certain issues, for sure. With that note, I want to at least close. I apologize. Many of you had your hands up and wanted to raise a question or issue. Maybe you'll have a minute or two to try and have a short conversation with our speakers following the close of today's event. But most of all, I want to extend my thanks once again to Georgetown University, to Evan for his study. Thanks very much to Elizabeth Economy and Liza Tobin for joining us today. And thank you all for being here. Thanks again.